Circus and the outrider Webster were squatting in the dust with a weathered old woman the color of pipe clay. Dry old crone, half naked, her paps like wrinkled aubergines hanging from under the shawl she wore. She stared at the ground, nor did she look up even when the horses stood all about her. Glanton looked down the square. The town appeared empty. There was a small company of soldiers garrisoned here, but they didn't turn out. Dust was blowing in the streets. His horse leaned and sniffed at the old woman and jerked its head and trembled, and Glanton patted the animal's neck and dismounted. She was in a meat camp about 8 miles up the river, said Webster. She can't walk. How many were there? We reckon maybe 15 or 20. They didn't have no stock to amount to anything. I don't know what she was doing. Glanton crossed in front of his horse, passing the reins behind his back. Watch her, Cap. She bites. She had raised her eyes to the level of his knee and took one of the heavy saddle pistols from its scabbard and cocked it. Watch yourself there. Several of the men stepped back. The woman looked up, neither courage nor heart sink in those old eyes. He pointed with his left hand, and she turned to follow his hand with her gaze, and he put the pistol to her head and fired. The explosion filled all that sad little park. Some of the horses shied and stepped. A fist-sized hole erupted out of the far side of the woman's head in a great vomit of gore, and she pitched over and lay slain in her blood without remedy. Glanton had already put the pistol at half, and he flicked away the spent primer with his thumb and was preparing to recharge the cylinder. McGill, he said. A Mexican solitary of his race in that company came forward. Get that receipt for us. He took a skinning knife from his belt and stepped to where the old woman lay, and took up her hair and twisted it about her wrist, and passed the blade of the knife about her skull and ripped away the scalp. Glanton looked at the men. They were stood, some looking down at the old woman, some already seeing to their mounts or their equipage. Only the recruits were watching Glanton. He seated a pistol ball in the mouth of the chamber, and then he raised his eyes and looked across the square. The juggler and his family stood, blusses, and beyond them, in the long mud facade, faces that had been watching from their doors and their naked windows dropped away like puppets in a gallop before the slow sweep of his eyes. He levered the ball home and capped the piece and spun the heavy pistol in his hand, and returned the horse's shoulder, and took the dripping trophy from McGill and turned it in the sun, and then handed it back and took up the trailing reins and led his horse out through the square toward the water. They made camp in a grove of cottonwoods across the creek, just beyond the walls of the town, and with dark they drifted in small groups through the smoky streets. The circus folk had set up a little pitch tent in the dusty plaza, and had stood a few poles up the crescents of burning oil. The juggler was beating a sort of snare drum made of tin and rawhide, and calling out in a high nasal voice his bill of entertainments, while the woman shrieked, "Passe, passe, passe," sweeping her arms about her in a gesture of the greatest spectacle. Toadvine and the kid watched among the milling citizenry. Bathcat leaned and spoke to them. "Look yonder, chappies." They turned to look where he pointed. The black stood stripped to the waist behind the tent, and as the juggler turned, with a sweep of his arm, the girl gave him a shove, and he leaped from the tent and strode about with strange posturings under the lapsing flare of the torches. Chapter 8. Another cantina, another advisor. Monty, a knifing. The darkest corner of the tavern, the most conspicuous. The Sereno, riding north. The meat camp. Granny Rat. Under the Animus Peaks. A confrontation and a killing. Another anchorite, another dawn. They paused without the cantina and pooled their coins, and Toadvine pushed aside the dried cowhide that hung for a door, and they entered a place where all was darkness and without definition. A lone lamp hung from a cross-tree in the ceiling, and in the shadows, dark figures sat smoking. They made their way across the room to a clay-tiled bar. The place reeked of wood smoke and sweat. A thin little man appeared before them and placed his hands ceremonially upon the tiles. "Dígame," he said. Toadvine took off his hat and put it on the bar and swept a clawed hand through his hair. "What have you got that a man could drink with just a minimum risk of blindness and death?" Come on. He cocked his thumb at his throat. "What have you got to drink?" he said. The barman turned and looked behind him at his wares. He seemed uncertain whether anything there would answer their requirements. "Mezcal? Suit everybody?" "Trot it out," said Bathcat. The barman poured the measures from a clay jar into 3 dented tin cups and pushed them forward with care, like counters on a board. "Quanto?" said Toadvine. The barman looked fearful. "Seis," he said. "Seis what?" The man held up 6 fingers. "Centavos," said Bathcat. Toadvine doled the coppers onto the bar and drained his cup and paid again. He gestured at the cups, all 3, with a wag of his finger. The kid took up his cup and drained it and set it down again. The liquor was rank, sour, tasted faintly of creosote. He was standing like the others with his back to the bar, and he looked over the room. At a table in the far corner, men were playing cards by the light of a single tallow candle. Along the wall opposite crouched figures, seeming alien to the light, who watched the Americans with no expression at all. "There's a game for you," said Toadvine. "Play Monty in the dark with a pack of niggers." He raised the cup and drained it and set it on the bar and counted the remaining coins. A man was shuffling toward them out of the gloom. He had a bottle under his arm, and he set it on the tiles with care, together with his cup, and spoke to the barman, and the barman brought him a clay pitcher of water. He turned the pitcher so that the handle of it stood to his right, and he looked at the kid. He was old, and he wore a flat-crowned hat of a type no longer much seen in that country, and he was dressed in dirty white cotton drawers and shirt. The huaraches he wore looked like dried and blackened fish lashed to the floors of his feet. "You are Texas?" he said. The kid looked at Toadvine. "You are Texas," the old man said. "I was Texas 3 years. He held up his hand. The forefinger was gone with the first joint, and perhaps he was showing them what happened in Texas, or perhaps he merely meant to count the years. He lowered the hand and turned to the bar and poured wine into the cup, and took up the jar of water and poured it sparingly after. He drank and set the cup down and turned to Toadvine. He wore thin white whiskers at the point of his chin, and he wiped them with the back of his hand before looking up again. "You are Sociedad de Guerra, contra los Barros." Toadvine didn't know. He looked like some loutish knight beriddled by a troll. The old man put a phantom rifle to his shoulder and made a noise with his mouth. He looked at the Americans. "You killed the Apache, no?" Toadvine looked at Bathcat. "What does he want?" he said. The Van Diemen Lander passed his own 3-fingered hand across his mouth, but he allowed no affinity. "The old man's full," he said, "or mad." Toadvine propped his elbows on the tiles behind him. He looked at the old man, and he spat on the floor. "Crazier than a runaway nigger, ain't you?" he said. There was a groan from the far side of the room. A man rose and went along the wall and bent to speak with others. The groans came again, and the old man passed his hand before his face twice and kissed the ends of his fingers and looked up. How much monies they pay you? He said. No one spoke. You kill Gomez. They pay you much monies. The man in the dark of the far wall moaned again. Madre de Dios, he called. Gomez, Gomez, said the old man. Even Gomez. Who can ride against the Tejanos? They are soldiers. Que soldados tan valientes. La sangre de Gomez. Sangre de la gente. He looked up. Blood, he said. These countries give much blood. This Mexico. This is a thirsty country. The blood of 1,000 Christs, nothing. He made a gesture toward the world beyond, where all the land lay under darkness, and all a great stained altar stone. He turned and poured his wine, and poured again from the water jar, temperate old man, and drank. The kid watched him. He watched him drink, and he watched him wipe his mouth. When he turned, he spoke neither to the kid nor Toadvine, but seemed to address the room. I pray to God for this country. I say that to you. I pray. I don't go into church. When I need to talk to them Doused there, I talk here. He pointed to his chest. When he turned to the Americans, his voice softened again. You are fine caballeros, he said. You kill the barbaros. They cannot hide from you. But there is another caballero, and I think that no man hides from him. I was a soldier. It is like a dream. When even the bones is gone in the desert, the dreams is talk to you. You don't wake up forever. He drained his cup and took up his bottle and went softly away on his sandals into the farther dim of the cantina. The man at the wall moaned again and called upon his god. The Van Diemenlander and the barman spoke together, and the barman gestured at the dark in the corner and shook his head, and the Americans chambered down their last cups, and Toadvine pushed the few tlacos toward the barman, and they went out. That was his son, said Batcat. Who was? The lad in the corner, cut with a knife. He was cut. One of the chaps at the table cut him. They were playing cards, and one of them cut him. Why don't he leave? I asked him the same myself. What did he say? He had a question for me. Said where would he go to? They made their way through the narrow, walled streets toward the gate and the fires of the camp beyond. A voice was calling. It called, Las 10:30, Tiempo Sereno. It was the watchman at his rounds, and he passed them with his lantern, calling softly the hour. In the pre-dawn dark, the sounds about described the scene to come. The first cries of birds in the trees along the river, and the clink of harness, and the snuffle of horses, and the gentle sound of their cropping. In the darkened village, roosters have begun. The air smells of horses and charcoal. The camp has begun to stir. Sitting all about in the accruing light are the children from the town. None of the men rising know how long they have been there in darkness and silence. When they rode through the square, the dead squaw was gone, and the dust was newly raked. The jugglers' lamps were stark and black atop their poles, and the fire was cold before the pitch tent. An old woman who had been chopping wood raised up and stood with the axe in both hands as they passed. They rode through the sacked Indian camp at mid-morning. The blackened sheets of meat draped across the bushes or hung from poles like strange dark laundry. Deer hides were pegged out on the ground, and white or ruddled bones lay strewn over the rocks in a primitive shambles. The horses cocked their ears and stepped quickly. They rode on. In the afternoon, Black Jackson caught them up. His mount surveyed it and all but blown. Glanton turned in the saddle and measured him with his eye. Then he nudged his horse forward, and the black fell in with his pale wayfellows, and all rode on as before. They didn't miss the veteran until that evening. The judge made his way down through the smoke of the cook fires and squatted before Toadvine and the kid. "What's become of Chambers?" he said. "I believe he's quit." "Quit?" "I believe he has." "Did he ride out this morning?" "Not with us, he did." "It was my understanding that you spoke for your group." Toadvine spat. "He appears to have spoke for himself." "When did you last see him?"
Oh, come on.
"Seen him yesterday evening." "But not this morning." "Not this morning." The judge regarded him. "Hell," said Toadvine. "I allowed you knowed he was gone. It ain't like he was so small you never would miss him."
Come on.
The judge looked at the kid. He looked at Toadvine again. Then he rose and went back. In the morning, 2 of the Delawares were gone. They rode on. By noon, they had begun to climb toward the gap in the mountains. Riding up through wild lavender or silkweed under the Animas peaks, the shadow of an eagle that had set forth from those high and craggy fastnesses crossed the line of riders below, and they looked up to mark it where it rode in that brittle blue and faultless void. They came up through pinon and scrub oak, and they crossed the gap through a high pine forest and rode on through the mountains. In the evening, they came out upon a mesa that overlooked all the country to the north. The sun to the west lay in a holocaust where there rose a steady column of small desert bats. And to the north, along the trembling perimeter of the world, dust was blowing down the void like the smoke of distant armies. The crumpled butcher paper mountains lay in sharp shadow fold under the long blue dusk, and in the middle distance, the glazed bed of a dry lake lay shimmering like the Mare Imbrium, and herds of deer were moving north in the last of the twilight, harried over the plain by wolves who were themselves the color of the desert floor. Blanton sat his horse and looked long out upon the scene. Sparse on the mesa, the dry weeds lashed in the wind like the earth's long echo of lance and spear in old encounters forever unrecorded. All the sky seemed troubled, and night came quickly over the evening land, and small gray birds flew crying softly after the fled sun. He chucked up the horse. He passed, and so passed all, into the problematical destruction of darkness. They camped that night on the foreplain at the foot of a talus slope, and the murder that had been reckoned upon took place. The white man, Jackson, had been drunk in Janos, and he had ridden red-eyed and sullen for 2 days through the mountains. He now sat disheveled by the fire with his boots off, drinking aguardiente from a flask, circumscribed about by his companions and by the cries of wolves and providence of night. He was sitting so when the black approached the fire and threw down his epichamore and sat upon it and fell to stoking his pipe. There were 2 fires in this camp, and no rules real or tacit as to who should use them. But when the white man looked at the other fire, he saw that the Delawares and John McGill and the new men in the company had taken their supper there, and with a gesture and a slurred oath, he warned the black away. Here, beyond men's judgments, all covenants were brittle. The black looked up from his pipe bowl. About that fire were men whose eyes gave back the light like coals socketed hot in their skulls, and men whose eyes did not. But the black man's eyes stood as corridors for the ferrying through of naked and unrectified night from what of it lay behind to what was yet to come. "Any man in this company can sit where it suits him," he said. The white man swung his head, one eye half closed, his lip loose. His gun belt lay coiled on the ground. He reached and drew the revolver and cocked it. 4 men rose and moved away. "You aim to shoot me?" said the black. You don't get your black ass away from this fire, I'll kill you graveyard dead. He looked to where Glanton sat. Glanton watched him. He put the pipe in his mouth and rose, and took up the episcomar and folded it over his arm. Is that your final say? Final as the judgment of God. The black looked once more across the flames at Glanton, and then he moved away in the dark. The white man uncocked the revolver and placed it on the ground before him. Two of the others came back to the fire and stood uneasily. Jackson sat with his legs crossed. One hand lay in his lap and the other was outstretched on his knee, holding a slender black cigarillo. The nearest man to him was Tobin, and when the black stepped out of the darkness bearing the bowie knife in both hands, like some instrument of ceremony, Tobin started to rise. The white man looked up drunkenly, and the black stepped forward and with a single stroke swapped off his head. Two thick ropes of dark blood and two slender rose like snakes from the stump of his neck and arched, hissing into the fire. The head rolled to the left and came to rest at the ex-priest's feet, where it lay with eyes aghast. Tobin jerked his foot away and rose and stepped back. The fire steamed and blackened, and a gray cloud of smoke rose, and the columnar arches of blood slowly subsided until just the neck bubbled gently like a stew, and then that too was stilled. He was sat as before, save headless, drenched in blood, the cigarillo still between his fingers, leaning toward the dark and smoking grotto in the flames where his life had gone. Glanton rose. The men moved away. No one spoke. When they set out in the dawn, the headless man was sitting like a murdered anchorite, discalced in ashes and sark. Someone had taken his gun, but the boots stood where he'd put them. The company rode on. They hadn't gone forth 1 hour upon that plain before they were ridden upon by the Apaches.
Oh, here we go. Oh.
Chapter 9. An ambuscado. The dead Apache. Hollow ground. A gypsum lake. Trebiones.
Oh, shit.
Snow-blind horses. The Delaware's return. A probate. The ghost coach. The copper mines. Squatters. A snake-bit horse. The judge on geological evidence. The dead boy. On parallax and false guidance in times past. The ciboleros.
What?
They were crossing the western edge of the playa when Glanton halted. He turned and placed one hand on the wooden cantle and looked toward the sun, where it sat new risen above the bald and fly-specked mountains to the east. The floor of the playa lay smooth and unbroken by any track, and the mountains and their blue islands stood footless in the void like floating temples. Toadvine and the kids sat their horses and gazed upon that desolation with the others. Out on the playa, a cold sea broke, and water gone these 1,000 years lay riffled silver in the morning wind. Sounds like a pack of hounds, said Toadvine. It sounds like geese to me. Suddenly, Bathcat and one of the Delawares turned their horses and quartered them and called out, and the company turned and milled and began to line out down the lake bed toward the thin line of scrub that marked the shore. Men were leaping from their horses and hobbling them instantly with loops of rope ready-made. By the time the animals were secured and they had thrown themselves on the ground under the creosote bushes with their weapons readied, the riders were beginning to appear far out on the lake bed, a thin frieze of mounted archers that trembled and veered in the rising heat. They crossed before the sun and vanished one by one and reappeared again, and they were black in the sun, and they rode out of that vanished sea like burnt phantoms, with the legs of the animals kicking up the spume that wasn't real, and they were lost in the sun and lost in the lake, and they shimmered and slurred together and separated again, and they augmented by planes and lurid avatars, and began to coalesce, and they began to appear above them in the dawn-broached sky, a hellish likeness of their ranks, riding huge and inverted, and the horses' legs incredibly elongate, trampling down the high, thin Cirrus, and the howling anti-warriors pendant from their mounts, immense and chimeric, and the high, wild cries carrying that flat and barren pan, like the cries of souls broke through some misweave in the weft of things into the world below. "They'll swing to their right," called Glenton, and as he spoke they did so, favoring their bow arms. The arrows came lofting up in the blue with the sun on their fletchings, and then suddenly gaining speed and passing with a waning whistle like the flight of wild ducks. The first rifle cracked. The kid was lying on his belly, holding the big Walker revolver in both hands, and letting off the shots slowly and with care, as if he'd done it all before in a dream. The warriors passed within 100 feet, 40, 50 of them, and went on up the edge of the lake and began to crumble in the serried plains of heat, and to break up silently and to vanish. The company lay under the creosote, recharging their pieces. One of the ponies was lying in the sand, breathing steadily, and others stood that bore arrows with a curious patience. Tate and Doc Irving pulled back to see about them. The others lay, watching the playa. They walked out, Toadvine and Glanton and the judge. They picked up a short-rifled musket bound in rawhide and studded about the stock with brass-headed tacks in varied designs. The judge looked north along the pale shore of the dry lake where the heathen had fled. He handed the rifle to Toadvine, and they went on. The dead man lay in a sandy wash. He was naked save for skin boots and a pair of wide Mexican drawers. The boots had pointed toes like buskins, and they had parfleche soles and high tops that were rolled down about the knees and tied. The sand in the wash was dark with blood. They stood there in the windless heat at the edge of the dry lake, and Glanton pushed him over with his boot. The painted face came up. Sand stuck to the eyeball. Sand stuck to the rancid grease with which he'd smeared his torso. You could see the hole where the ball from Toadvine's rifle had gone in above the lower rib. The man's hair was long and black and dull with dust, and a few lice scuttled. There were slashes of white paint on the cheeks, and there were chevrons of paint above the nose, and figures in dark red paint under the eyes and on the chin. He was old, and he bore a healed lance wound just above the hip bone, and an old saber wound across the left cheek that ran to the corner of his eye. These wounds were decorated their length with tattooed images, perhaps obscure with age, but without reference in the known desert about.
Like Crick.
The judge knelt with his knife and cut the strap of the tiger-skin war bag the man carried, and emptied it in the sand. It held an eye shield made from a raven's wing, a rosary of fruit seeds, a few gun flints, a handful of lead balls. It held also a calculus or mad stone from the inward parts of some beast, and this the judge examined and pocketed. The other effects he spread with the palm of his hand, as if there was something to be read there. Then he ripped open the man's drawers with his knife. Tied alongside the dark genitals was a small skin bag, and this the judge cut away and also secured in the pocket of his vest. Lastly, he secured the dark locks and swept them up from the sand and cut away the scalp. Then they rose and returned, leaving him to scrutinize with his drying eyes the calamitous advance of the sun. They rode all day upon a pale gastine, sparsely grown with saltbush and panic.
This must be it.
In the evening they entrained upon a hollow ground that rang so roundly under the horses' hooves that they stepped and sidled and rolled their eyes like circus animals. And that night as they lay in that ground, each heard, all heard, the dull boom of a rock falling somewhere far below them in the awful darkness inside the world. On the day that followed, they crossed a lake of gypsum, so fine the ponies left no track upon it. The riders wore masks of bone black smeared about their eyes, and some had blacked the eyes of their horses. The sun reflected off the pan burned the undersides of their faces, and shadow of horse and rider alike were painted upon the fine white powder in purest indigo. Far out in the desert to the north, dust spouts rose wobbling and augured the earth, and some said they'd heard of pilgrims borne aloft like dervishes in those mindless corridors, to be dropped broken and bleeding upon the desert again, and there perhaps to watch the thing that had destroyed them lurch onward like some drunken djinn, and resolve itself once more into the elements from which it sprang. Out of that whirlwind no voice spoke, and the pilgrim lying in his broken bones may cry out, and in his anguish he may rage, but rage at what? And if the dried and blackened skeleton is found among the sands by travelers to come yet, who can discover the engine of his ruin? That night they sat at the fire like ghosts in their dusty beards and clothing, wrapped, pyrolatrous. The fires died, and small coals scampered down the plain, and sand crept past in the dark all night like armies of lice on the move. In the night, some of the horses began to scream, and daybreak found several so crazed with snow blindness they required to be shot. When they rode out, the Mexican they called McGill was on his third horse in as many days. He could not have blacked the eyes of the pony he'd ridden coming up from the dry lake, short of muzzling it like a dog. And the horse he now rode was wilder yet, and there were only 3 animals left in the caballo. That afternoon, the 2 Delawares that had left them a day out of Hobbles caught them up where they nooned at a mineral well. They had with them the veteran's horse, still saddled. Glanton walked out to where the animal stood and took up the trailing reins and led it to the fire, where he removed the rifle from the scabbard and handed it to David Brown, and then began to go through the wallet strapped to the cantle and to pitch the veteran's meager effects into the fire. He undid the girth straps and loosed the other accoutrements and piled them onto the flames. Blankets, saddle, all. The greasy wool and leather sending up a foul gray smoke. Then they rode on. They were moving north, and for 2 days the Delawares read the smokes on the distant peaks, and then the smoke stopped, and there were no more. As they entered the foothills, they came upon a dusty old diligence with 6 horses in the traces, grazing the dry grass in a fold among the barren scrag. A deputation cut for the carriage, and the horses jerked their heads and shied and went trotting. The riders harried them about the basin until they were circling like paper horses in a wind trap, and the diligence rattling after with one broken wheel. The black walked out waving his hat and called them off, and he approached the yoked horses with the hat outheld and talked to them where they stood trembling until they could reach the trailing straps. Glanton walked past him and opened the carriage door. The inside of the coach was splintered up with new wood, and a dead man slumped out and hung head down. There was another man inside, and a young boy, and they lay in Hearst with their weapons and a stink to drive a buzzard off a gut cart. Glanton took the guns and ammunition and handed them out. 2 men climbed to the freight deck and cut away the ropes and the tattered tarp, and they kicked down a steamer trunk and an old rawhide dispatch box and broke them open. Glanton cut the straps on the dispatch box with his knife and tipped the box out in the sand. Letters penned for any destination save here began to skitter and drift away down the canyon. There were a few tagged bags of ore samples in the box, and he emptied them on the ground and kicked at the lumps of ore and looked about. He looked inside the coach again, and then he spat and turned and looked the horses over. They were big American horses, but badly used up. He directed 2 of them cut out of the traces, and then he waved the black away from the lead horse and whacked at his hat at the animals. They set off down the floor of the canyon, mismatched and sawing in the harness, the Diligence swaying on its leather springs, and the dead man dangling out of the clapping door. They diminished upon the plain to the west, first the sound and then the shape of them, dissolving in the heat rising off the sand until they were no more than a mote struggling in that hallucinatory void, and then nothing at all. The riders rode on. All afternoon they rode single file up through the mountains. A small gray lanauret flew about them as if seeking their banner, and then it shied away over the plain below on its slender falcon wings. They rode on through sandstone cities on the dusk of that day, past castle and keep and wind-fashioned watchtower and stone granaries in sun and in shadow. They rode through marl and terracotta and rifts of copper shale, and they rode through a wooded swag and out upon a promontory overlooking a bleak and barren caldera where lay the abandoned ruins of Santa Rita del Cobre. Here they made a dry and fireless camp. They sent down scouts, and Glanton walked out on the bluff and sat in the dusk, watching the darkness deepen in the gulf below to see if any light would show itself down there. The scouting party returned in the dark, and it was still dark in the morning when the company mounted and rode out. They entered the caldera in a condition of half-gray dawn, riding single file through the shaly streets between rows of old adobes abandoned these dozen years past when the Apaches cut off the wagon trains from Chihuahua and laid the works under siege. The starving Mexicans had set out afoot on the long journey south, but none ever arrived. The Americans rode past the slag and rubble and the dark shapes of shaft mouths, and they rode past the smelting house where piles of ore stood about, and weathered wagons and ore carts bone white in the dawn, and the dark iron shapes of abandoned machinery. They crossed a stony arroyo and rode on through that gutted terrain to a slight rise where sat the old Presidio, a large triangular building of adobe with round towers at the corners. There was a single door in the east wall, and as they approached, they could see rising the smoke that they had smelled in the morning air. Glanton pounded on the door with his rawhide-covered club like a traveler at an inn. A bluish light suffused the hills about, and the tallest peaks to the north stood in the only sun, while all the caldera lay in darkness yet. The echo of his knocking clapped about the stark and riven walls of rock and returned. The men sat their horses. Glanton gave the door a kick. "Come out if you're white," he called. "Who's there?" called the voice. Glanton spat. "Who is it?" they called. "Open it," said Glanton. They waited. Chains were drawn rapidly across the wood. The tall door creaked inward, and a man stood before them at the ready with a rifle. Glanton touched his horse with his knee, and it raised its head along the door and forced it open, and they rode through. In the gray murk within the compound, they dismounted and tied. A few old freight wagons stood about, some looted of their wheels by travelers. There was a lamp burning in one of the offices.
Echo cancel.
Glanton crossed the triangle. The men stepped aside. "We thought you was Injuns," they said. There were 4 left out of a party of 7 that had set out for the mountains to prospect for precious metals. They had been barricaded in the old Presidio for 3 days, fled here from the desert of the south, pursued by the savages. One of the men was shot through the lower chest, and he lay propped against the wall in the office. Irving came in and looked at him. "What have you done for him?" he said. "Ain't done nothing." "What do you want me to do for him?" "Ain't asked you to do nothing." "That's good," said Irving, "because there ain't nothing to be done." He looked at them. They were foul and ragged and half-crazed. They'd been making forays at night up the arroyo for wood and water, and they had been feeding off a dead mule that lay gutted and stinking in the far corner of the yard. The first thing they asked for was whiskey, and the next was tobacco. They had but 2 animals, and one of these had been snake-bit in the desert. And this thing now stood in the compound with its head enormously swollen and grotesque, like some fabled equine ideation out of an attic tragedy. It had been bitten on the nose, and its eyes bulged out of the shapeless head in a horror of agony. And it tottered moaning toward the clustered horses of the company with its long, misshapen muzzle swinging and drooling, and its breath wheezing in the throttle pipes of its throat. The skin had split open along the bridge of its nose, and the bone shone through pinkish white, and its small ears looked like paper spills twisted into either side of a hairy loaf of dough. The American horses began to mill and separate along the wall at its approach, and it swung after them blindly. There was a flurry of thumps and kicks, and the horses began to circle the compound. A small mottled stallion belonging to one of the Delawares came out of the remuda and struck at the thing twice, and then turned and buried its teeth in its neck. Out of the mad horse's throat came a sound that brought the men to the door. "Why don't you shoot that thing?" said Irving. "The sooner it dies, the sooner it'll rot," they said. Irving spat. "You aim to eat it, and it's snake-bit?" They looked at one another. They didn't know. Irving shook his head and went out. Glanton and the judge looked at the squatters, and the squatters looked at the floor. Some of the roof beams were half down into the room, and the floor was filled with mud and rubble. Into these ruinous works the morning sun now slanted, and Glanton could see crouched in a corner a Mexican or half-breed boy, maybe 12 years old. He was naked save for a pair of old calzones and makeshift sandals of uncured hide. He glared back at Glanton with a sort of terrified insolence. "Who's this child?" said the judge. They shrugged. They looked away. Glanton spat and shook his head.
Only with the judge.
They posted guards atop the azotea and unsaddled the horses and drove them out to graze. And the judge took one of the pack animals and emptied out the panniers and went off to explore the works. In the afternoon, he sat in the compound breaking ore samples with a hammer. The feldspar, rich in red oxide of copper, and native nuggets in whose organic lobations he purported to read news of the Earth's origins, holding an extemporary lecture in geology to a small gathering who nodded and spat. A few would quote him scripture to confound his ordering up of eons out of the ancient chaos and other apostate supposings. The judge smiled. "Books lie," he said. "God don't lie." "No," said the judge. "He does not. And these are his words." He held up a chunk of rock. "He speaks in stones and trees, the bones of things." The squatters in their rags nodded among themselves and were soon reckoning him correct, this man of learning, in all his speculations. And this the judge encouraged until they were right proselytes of the new order, whereupon he laughed at them for fools. That evening, the main part of the company quartered themselves on the dry clay of the compound under the stars. Before morning rain would drive them in, huddled in the dark mud cubicles along the south wall. In the office of the Presidio, they built a fire in the floor, and the smoke rose through the ruined roof. And Glanton and the judge and their lieutenants sat about the blaze and smoked their pipes, while the squatters stood off to one side, chewing the tobacco they'd been given and spitting at the wall. The half-breed boy watched them with his dark eyes. To the west, among the low, dark hills, they could hear the howling of a wolf that the squatters did mistrust, and the hunters smiled among themselves. In a night so beclamored with the jackal yapping of coyotes and the cries of owls, the howl of that old dog wolf was the one sound they knew to issue from its right form, a solitary lobo, perhaps gray at the muzzle, hung like a marionette from the moon with his long mouth gibbering. It grew cold in the night, and it blew stormy with wind and rain. And soon all the wild menagerie of that country grew mute.
Here.
A horse put its long, wet face in at the door, and Glanton looked up and spoke to it, and it lifted its head and curled its lip, and withdrew into the rain and the night. The squatters observed this, as they observed everything, with their shifting eyes, and one of them allowed that he would never make a pet of a horse. Glanton spat at the fire and looked at the man where he sat horseless in his rags, and he shook his head at the wonderful invention of folly in its guises and forms. The rain had slacked, and in the stillness a long crack of thunder rolled overhead and clanged among the rocks, and then the rain came harder until it was pouring through the blackened opening in the roof and steaming and hissing in the fire. One of the men rose and dragged up the rotted ends of some old beams and piled them onto the flames. The smoke spread along the sagging vigas above them, and little streams of liquid clay started down from the sawed roof. Outside, the compound lay under sheets of water that slashed about in the gusts, and the light of the fire falling from the door laid a pale band upon that shallow sea, along which the horses stood like roadside spectators waiting an event. From time to time, one of the men would rise and go out, and his shadow would fall among the animals, and they would raise and lower their dripping heads and dap their hooves, and then wait in the rain again. The men who had been on watch entered the room and stood steeped before the fire. The blacks stood at the door, neither in nor out. Someone had reported the judge naked atop the walls, immense and pale in the revelations of lightning, striding the perimeter up there and declaiming in the old epic mode.
You're gonna die.
Glanton watched the fire silently, and the men composed themselves in their blankets in the drier places about the floor, and soon they were asleep.
I'll get it.
In the morning, the rain had ceased. The water stood in pools in the courtyard, and the snake-bit horse lay dead with its shapeless head stretched in the mud, and the other animals had gathered in the northeast corner under the tower and stood facing the wall. The peaks to the north were white with snow in the new risen sun, and when Toadvine stepped out into the day, the sun was just touching the upper walls of the compound, and the judge was standing in the gently steaming quiet, picking his teeth with a thorn as if he had just eaten. "Morning," said the judge. "Morning," said Toadvine. "Looks fair to clear." "It done has clear," said Toadvine. The judge turned his head and looked toward the pristine cobalt keep of the visible day. An eagle was crossing the gorge with the sun very white on its head and tail feathers. "So it has," said the judge. "So it has." The squatters emerged and stood about the cantonment, blinking like birds. They had elected among themselves to join the company, and when Glanton came across the yard leading his horse, the spokesman for the group stepped forward to inform him of their decision. Glanton didn't even look at him. He entered the quartel and got his saddle and gear. In the meantime, someone had found the boy. He was lying face down, naked in one of the cubicles. Scattered about on the clay were great numbers of old bones, as if he, like others before him, had stumbled upon a place where something inimitable lived. The squatters crowded in and stood about the corpse in silence. Soon they were conversing senselessly about the merits and virtues of the dead boy. In the compound, the scalp hunters mounted up and turned their horses toward the gates that now stood open to the east to welcome in the light and to invite their journey. As they rode out, the doomed man hostled in that place came dragging the boy out and laid him in the mud. His neck had been broken, and his head hung straight down, and it flopped over strangely when they let him onto the ground. The hills beyond the mine pit were reflected grayly in the pools of rainwater in the courtyard, and the partly eaten mule lay in the mud with its hindquarters missing, like something from a chromo of terrific war. Within the doorless quartel, the man who had been shot sang church hymns and cursed God alternately. The squatters stood about the dead boy with their wretched firearms at rest, like some tatterdemalion guard of honor. Glanton had given them a half-pound of rifle powder and some primers and a small pig of lead. And as the company rode out, some looked back at them, 3 men standing there without expression. No one raised a hand in farewell. The dying man by the ashes of the fire was singing, and as they rode out, they could hear the hymns of their childhood. And they could hear them as they ascended the arroyo and rode up through the low junipers still wet from the rain. The dying man sang with great clarity and intention, and the riders setting forth up country may have ridden more slowly the longer to hear him, for they were of just these qualities themselves. They rode that day through low hills, barren save for the scrub evergreens. Everywhere in this high parkland deer leapt and scattered, and the hunters shot several from their saddles, and gutted and packed them, and by evening they had acquired a retinue of 6 wolves of varying size and color that trotted behind them single file, and watched over their own shoulders to see that each should follow in his place. At dusk they halted and built a fire and roasted the deer. The night was much enclosed about them, and there were no stars. To the north they could see other fires that burned red and sullen along the invisible ridges. They ate and moved on, leaving the fire on the ground behind them. And as they rode up into the mountains, this fire seemed to become altered of its location, now here, now there, drawing away, or shifting unaccountably along the flank of their movement. Like some Ignace Vacuous belated upon the road behind them, which all could see and of which none spoke. For this will to deceive that is in things luminous may manifest itself likewise in retrospect, and so by sleight of some fixed part of a journey already accomplished, may also post-mortem fraudulent destinies. As they rode that night upon the mesa, they saw come toward them, much like their own image, a party of riders, pieced out of the darkness by the intermittent flare of the dry lightning to the north. Glanton halted and sat his horse, and the company halted behind him. The silent riders hove on. When they were 100 yards out, they too halted, and all sat in silent speculation at this encounter. "Who are you?" called Glanton. "Amigos, somos amigos." They were counting each other's number. "De donde viene?" called the strangers. "A donde va?" called the judge. They were ciboleros, down from the north, their pack horses laden with dried meat. They were dressed in skins sewn with the ligaments of beasts, and they sat their animals in the way of men seldom off them. They carried lances with which they hunted the wild buffalo on the plains, and these weapons were dressed with tassels of feathers and colored cloth. And some carried bows, and some carried old fusils with tasseled stoppers in their bores. The dried meat was packed in hides, and other than the few arms among them, they were innocent of civilized device as the rawest savage of that land. They parleyed without dismounting, and the ciboleros lighted their small cigarrillos and told that they were bound for the markets at Mesilla. The Americans might have traded for some of the meat, but they carried no tantamount goods, and the disposition to exchange was foreign to them. And so these parties divided upon that midnight plain, each passing back the way the other had come, pursuing, as all travelers must, inversions without end upon other men's journeys. Chapter 10. Tobin. The skirmish on the Little Colorado. The catalysis. How came the learned man? Glanton and the judge. A new course. The judge and the bats. Guano. The deserters. Saltpeter and charcoal.
Oh, fuck yeah.
The Malpais.
This is it.
Footprints. The volcano. Brimstone. The Matrix. The slaughter of the Aborigines.
Yup.
In the days to follow, all trace of the Heleños faded, and they pushed deeper into the mountains. By fires of highland driftwood, pale as bone, they crouched in silence while the flames yawed and the night winds ascending those stony draws. The kid sat with his legs crossed, mending a strap with an awl he'd borrowed from the ex-priest Tobin, and the frockless one looked on as he worked. "You've done this before," said Tobin. The kid wiped his nose with a swipe of his greasy sleeve and turned the piece in his lap. "Not me," he said. "Well, you've the knack, more so than me. There's little equity in the Lord's gifts." The kid looked up at him and then bent to his work again. "That's so," said the ex-priest. "Look around you. Study the judge." "I done studied him." "Mayhaps he ain't to your liking, fair enough, but the man's a hand at anything. I've never seen him turn to a task for what he didn't prove clever at it." The kid drove the greased thread through the leather and hauled it taut. "He speaks Dutch," said the ex-priest. "Dutch?" "Aye." The kid looked at the ex-priest. He bent to his mending. "He does, for I heard him do it. We cut a parcel of crazy pilgrims down off the Llano, and the old man in the lead of them, he spoke right up in Dutch, like we were all of us in Dutchland, and the judge give him right back. Glanton come near falling off his horse. We none of us knew him to speak it. Asked where he learned it. You know what he said?" "What did he say?" "Said offered Dutchman." The ex-priest spat. "I couldn't have learned it off 10 Dutchmen. What about you?" The kid shook his head. "No," said Tobin. "The gifts of the Almighty are weighed and parceled out in a scale peculiar to himself. It's no fair accounting, and I don't doubt but what he'd be the first to admit it, and you put the query to him boldface." "Who?" "The Almighty, the Almighty." The ex-priest shook his head. He glanced across the fire toward the judge. That great, hairless thing. You wouldn't think to look at him that he could outdance the devil himself, now would you? God, the man is a dancer. You'll not take that away from him. And fiddle. He's the greatest fiddler I ever heard, and that's an end on it. The greatest. He can cut a trail, shoot a rifle, ride a horse, track a deer. He's been all over the world. Him and the governor, they sat up till breakfast, and it was Paris this and London that in 5 languages. You'd have given something to have heard him. The governor's a learned man himself, he is, but the judge... The ex-priest shook his head. Oh, it may be the Lord's way of showing how little store he sets by the learned. Whatever could it mean to one who knows all? He's an uncommon love for the common man, and godly wisdom resides in the least of things, so that it may well be that the voice of the Almighty speaks most profoundly in such beings as lives in silence themselves. He watched the kid. Well, let it go how it will, he said. God speaks in the least of creatures. The kid thought him to mean birds or things that crawl.
Nope.
But the ex-priest, watching, his head slightly cocked, said, No man is give leave of that voice. The kid spat into the fire and bent to his work. I ain't heard no voice, he said. When it stops, said Tobin, you'll know you've heard it all your life. Is that right? Aye. The kid turned the leather in his lap. The ex-priest watched him. At night, said Tobin, when the horses are grazing and the company is asleep, who hears them grazing? Don't nobody hear them if they're asleep. Aye. And if they cease their grazing, who is it that wakes? Every man. Aye, said the ex-priest. Every man. The kid looked up. And the judge? Does the voice speak to him? The judge, said Tobin. He didn't answer. I seen him before, said the kid. In Nacogdoches. Tobin smiled. Every man in the company claims to have encountered that sooty-souled rascal in some other place. Tobin rubbed his beard on the back of his hand. He saved us all. I have to give him that. We come down off the Little Colorado. We didn't have a pound of powder in the company. Pound. We'd not a dram on it. There he sat on a rock in the middle of the greatest desert you'd ever want to see. Just perched on this rock like a man waiting for a coach. Brown thought him a mirage. Might have shot him for one if he'd had aught to shoot him with. How come you'd have no powder? Shot it all up with the savages. Holed up 9 days in a cave. Lost most of the horses. We were 38 men when we left Chihuahua City, and we were 14 when the judge found us. Mortally whipped, on the run. Every man jack of us knew that in that godforsook land somewhere was a draw or a cul-de-sac, or perhaps just a pile of rocks, and there we'd be driven to a stand with those empty guns. The judge. Give the devil his due. The kid held the tack in one hand, the awl in the other. He watched the ex-priest. We'd been on the plain all night and well up into the next day. The Delawares kept calling halts and dropping to the ground to give a listen. There was no place to run and no place to hide. I don't know what they wanted to hear. We knew the bloody niggers was out there, and speaking for myself, that was already an abundance of information. I didn't need more. That sunrise would look to be our last. We were all watching the backtrack. I don't know how far you could see, 15, 20 miles. Then about the meridian of that day, we come upon the judge on his rock there in that wilderness by his single self. Now, there was no rock, just the one. Irving said he'd brought it with him. I said that it was a mere stone, for to mark him out of nothing at all. He had with him that self-same rifle you see with him now, all mounted in German silver, and the name that he'd give it set with silver wire under the check piece in Latin. Et in Arcadia Ego. A reference to the lethal in it. Common enough for a man to name his gun. I've heard Sweet Lips and Hark from the Tombs and every sort of lady's name. His is the first and only ever I seen with an inscription from the classics. And there he sat. No horse. Just him and his legs crossed, smiling as we rode up, like he'd been expecting us. He'd an old canvas kit bag and an old woolen Benjamin over the one shoulder. In the bag was a brace of pistols and a good assortment of specie, gold and silver. He didn't even have a canteen. It was like you couldn't tell where he'd come from. Said he'd been with a wagon company and fell out to go it alone. Davy wanted to leave him there. Didn't set well with his honor, and it don't to this day. Glanton just studied him. It was a day's work to even guess what he made of that figure on that ground. I don't know to this day. They've a secret commerce, some terrible covenant. You mind, you'll see I'm right. He called for the last of 2 pack animals we had, and he cut the straps and left the wallets to lay where they fell, and the judge mounted up, and he and Glanton rode side by side, and soon they was conversing like brothers. The judge sat that animal bareback like an Indian, and rode with his grip and his rifle perched on the withers, and he looked about him with the greatest satisfaction in the world, as if everything had turned out just as he planned, and the day could not have been finer. We'd not rode far before he struck us a new course, about 9 points to the east. He pointed out a range of mountains, maybe 30 miles distant, and we pulled for those mountains, and none of us asked what for. By then, Glanton had given him the particulars of the situation in which he'd installed himself. But it being naked of arms in that wilderness and half of all the patcheria in pursuit worried him at all, he kept it to himself entire. The ex-priest had paused to rekindle his pipe, reaching into the raw fire for a coal, as did the Red Scouts, and then setting it back among the flames as if it had a proper place there. Now, what do you reckon it was in them mountains that we set out for? And how did he come to know of it? How to find it? How to put it to use? Tobin seemed to frame these questions to himself. He was regarding the fire, pulling on his pipe. How indeed, he said. We reached the foothills in the early evening and rode up a dry arroyo and pushed on, I guess, till midnight and made camp with neither wood nor water. Come morning, we could see them on the plain to the north, maybe 10 miles out. They were riding 4 and 6 abreast, and there was no short supply of them, and they were in no hurry. The judge had been up all night, by what the vidette said, watching the bats. He would go up the side of the mountain and make notes in a little book, and then he would come back down. Couldn't have been more cheerful. 2 men had deserted in the night, and that made us down to 12, and the judge 13. I gave him my best study, the judge, then and now. He appeared to be a lunatic, and then not. Glanton, I always knew, was mad. We left out with the first light up a little wooded draw. We were on the north slope, and there was willow and alder and cherry growing out of the rock, just little trees. The judge would stop to botanize, and then ride to catch up. My hand to God, pressing leaves into his book. Sure, I never saw the equal to it, and all the time, the savages in plain view below us. And on that pan, God, I'd put a crick in my neck. I couldn't keep my eyes off of them. And they were 100 souls if they were one. We come out on some flinty ground where it was all juniper, and we just went on. No attempt to put their trackers at fault. We rode all that day. We saw no more of the savages, for they were come under the lee of the mountain, or somewhere on the slopes below us. As soon as it was dusk and the bats was about, the judge, he altered our course again, riding along, holding on to his hand, looking up at the little animals. We got broke up and scattered all in the junipers, and we halted to regroup and to recruit the horses. We sat around in the dark. No one spoke a word. When the judge got back, he and Glanton whispered among themselves, and then we moved on. We led the horses in the dark. There was no trail, just steep, scrabbly rock. When we reached the cave, some of the men thought that he meant for us to hide there, and that he was, for a fact, daft altogether. But it was the nighter. The nighter, you see.
Guano.
We left all that we owned at the mouth of that cave, and we filled our wallets and panniers and our mochilas with the cave dirt, and we left out at daybreak. When we topped the rise above that place and looked back, there was a great spout of bats being sucked down into the cave. Thousands of the creatures. And they continued so for an hour or more. And even then, it was just that we could no longer see them. The judge, we left him at a high pass, a little Clearwater Creek. Him and one of the Delawares. He told us to circle the mountain and to return to that place in 48 hours. We unloaded all the containers onto the ground and took the 2 horses with us, and him and the Delaware commenced lugging the panniers and the wallets up that little creek. I watched him go, and I said that I would never set eyes on that man again. Tobin looked at the kid. Never in this world. I thought Glanton would leave him. We went on. The next day, on the far side of the mountain, we encountered the 2 lads that had deserted us, hanging upside down in a tree. They had been skinned, and I can tell you, it does very little for a man's appearance. But if the savages hadn't guessed it already, now they knew for sure that we'd none of us any powder. We would not ride the animals, just leave them, keep them off the rocks, hold their noses if they snuffled. But in those 2 days, the judge leached out the guano with creek water and wood ash, and precipitated it out, and he built a clay kiln and burned charcoal in it. Doused the fire by day, and fired it again come dark. When we found him and the Delaware was setting in the creek stark naked, and they appeared at first to be drunk, but on what none could surmise. The entire top of that mountain was covered with Apache Indians, and there sat he. He got up when he seen us, and went to the willows, and come back with a pair of wallets, and in one was about 8 pounds of pure crystal saltpeter, and in the other about 3 pounds of fine alder charcoal. He'd ground the charcoal to a powder in the hollow of a rock. You could have made ink of it. He lashed the bags shut and put them across the pommel of Blanton's saddle. And him and the Indian got their clothes, and I was glad of it, for I never seen a grown man without a hair to his body, and him weighing 24 stone, which he did then and does now. And by my own warrant, for I added up the counters on the bar with my own and sober eyes at a stock scale in Chihuahua City in that same month and year. We went down the mountain with no scouts, nothing, just straight up. We were dead for sleep. It was dark when we reached the plain, and we grouped and took a head count, and then we rode out. The moon was about 3/4 full and waxing, and we were like circus riders, not a sound, the horses on eggshells. We'd no way of knowing where the savages was. The last clue we'd had of their vicinity was the poor buggers flayed in the tree. We set out dead west across the desert. Doc Irving was before me, and it was that bright I could count the hairs on his head. We rode all night, and toward the morning, just as the moon was down, we come upon a band of wolves. They scattered and come back. Not a sound out of them, no more than smoke. They'd drift off and quarter around and circle the horses, bold as brass. We'd cut at them with our hobbles, and they would slip past. You couldn't hear them on the hard pan. They would mutter and grouse or pop their teeth. Glanton halted, and the thing swirled around and slank off and come back. 2 of the Delawares backtracked off to the left a bit, braver souls than me, and sure they found the kill. 'Twas a young buck antelope, newly killed the evening before. It was about half consumed, and we set upon it with our knives and took the rest of the meat with us, and we ate it raw in the saddle. And it was the first meat we'd seen in 6 days. Froze for it we were, foraging on the mountain for piñon nuts like bears, and glad to get them. We left little more than bones for the lobos, but I would never shoot a wolf, and I know other men of the same sentiments. In all this time, the judge had spoke hardly a word. So at dawn, we were on the edge of a vast malpais, and His Honor takes up a position on some lava rocks there, and he commences to give us an address. It was like a sermon, but it was no such sermon as any man of us had ever heard before. Beyond the malpais was a volcanic peak, and in the sunrise it was many colors. And there was dark little birds crossing down the wind, and the wind was flapping the judge's old Benjamin about him. And he pointed to that stark and solitary mountain, and delivered himself of an oration to what end I know not, then or now. And he concluded with telling us that our mother the earth, as he said, was round like an egg, and contained all good things within her. Then he turned and led the horse he had been riding across that terrain of black and glassy slag, treacherous to man and beast alike, and us behind him like the disciples of a new faith. The ex-priest broke off and tapped a dead pipe against the heel of his boot. He looked at the judge over the way where he sat with his torso bared to the flames, as was his practice. He turned and regarded the kid. The malpais. It was a maze. You'd run out upon a little promontory, and you'd be balked about by the steep crevasses. You wouldn't dare to jump them. Sharp black glass, the edges, and sharp the flinty rocks below. We led the horses with every care, and still they were bleeding about their hooves. Our boots was cut to pieces. Clambering over those old caved and rimpled plates, you could see well enough how things had gone in that place. Rocks melted and set up all wrinkled like a pudding. the earth stove through to the molten core of her, where, for aught any man knows, lies the locality of hell. For the earth is a globe in the void, and truth there is no up nor down to it. And there's men in this company, besides myself, seen little cloven hoofprints in the stone, clever as a little doe in her going. But what little doe ever tried melting rock? I'd not go behind Scripture, but it may be that there has been sinners so notorious evil that the fires coughed them up again. And I could well see in the long ago how it was little devils with their pitchforks that traversed that fiery vomit for to salvage back those souls that had by misadventure been spewed up from their damnation onto the outer shelves of the world. Aye, it's a notion, no more. But someplace in the scheme of things, this world must touch the other. And something put them little hooflet markings in the lava flow, for I seen them there myself. The judge, he seemed not to take his eyes from that dead cone, where it rose off the desert like a great chanker. We followed solemn as owls, so that he turned to look back, and he did laugh when he seen our faces. At the foot of the mountain, we drew lots, and we sent 2 men to go on with the horses. I watched them go. One of them is at this fire tonight, and I saw him lead them horses away over the slaglands like a doomed man. And we were not doomed ourselves, I don't reckon. When I looked up, he was already upon the slope, hand and foot. The judge was, his bag over his shoulder and his rifle for alpenstock. And so did we all go. Not halfway up, we could already see the savages out on the plain. We climbed on. I thought at worst we'd throw ourselves into the cauldron rather than be taken by those fiends. We climbed up, and I reckon it was midday when we reached the top. We were done in. The savages not 10 miles out. I looked at the men about me, and sure they didn't look much. The dignity was gone out of them. They were good hearts all, then and now, and I did not like to see them so, and I thought the judge had been sent among us for a curse. And yet, he proved me wrong. At the time he did. I'm of 2 minds again now. He was the first to the rim of the cone for all the size of him, and he stood gazing about like he'd come for the view. Then he sat down, and he began to scale at the rock with his knife. One by one, we straggled up, and he sat with his back to that gaping hole, and he was chipping away, and he called upon us to do the same. It was brimstone, a wheel of brimstone all about the rim of the cauldron, bright yellow, and shining here and there with the little flakes of silica, but most pure flowers of sulfur. We chipped it loose and chopped it fine with our knives till we had about 2 pounds of it. And then the judge took the wallets and went to a cupped place in the rock and dumped out the charcoal and the niter and stirred them about with his hand and poured the sulfur in. I didn't know about what we'd be required to bleed into it like Freemasons, but it wasn't so. He worked it up dry with his hands, and all the while the savages down there on the plain drawing nigh to us. And when I turned back, the judge was standing, the great hairless oaf, and he took out his pizzle, and he was pissing into the mixture, pissing with a great vengeance, and one hand aloft, and he cried out for us to do likewise. We were half mad anyways, all lined up, Delawares and all, every man save Glanton, and he was a study. We hauled forth our members, and at it we went, and the judge on his knees kneading the mass with his naked arms, and the piss was splashing about, and he was crying out to us to piss, man, piss for your very souls, for can't you see the redskins yonder? And laughing the while, and working up this great mass in a foul black dough, a devil's batter by the stink of it, and him not a bloody dark pastryman himself, I don't suppose. And he pulls out his knife, and he commences to trowel it across the south-facing rocks, spreading it out thin with the knife blade, and watching the sun with one eye, and him smeared with blacking and reeking of piss and sulfur, and grinning and wielding the knife with a dexterity that was wondrous, like he did it every day of his life. And when he was done, he sat back and wiped his hands on his chest, and then he watched the savages, and so did we all. They were on the Mont Pais by then. They had a tracker who followed us every step on that naked rock, falling back at each blind head and calling out to the others. I don't know what he followed. A scent, perhaps. We could soon hear them talking down there. Then they seen us. Well, God in his glory knows what they thought. They were scattered out across the lava, and one of them pointed, and they all looked up. Thunderstruck, no doubt, to see 11 men perched on the topmost rim of that scalded atoll like misflown birds. They parleyed, and we watched to see would they dispatch any of their number after the horses, but they didn't. Their greed overcame all else, and they started for the base of the cone, scrambling over the lava to see who would be first. We had, I would suppose, an hour. We watched the savages, and we watched the judge's foul matrix drying on the rocks, and we watched the cloud that was making for the sun. One by one, we give up watching the rocks or the savages, either one, for the cloud did look to be dead set for the sun. And it would have took the better part of an hour to have crossed it, and that was the last hour we had. Well, the judge was sitting making entries in his little book, and he saw the cloud same as every other man, and he put down the book and watched it, and we did all. No one spoke. There was none to curse and none to pray. We just watched. And that cloud just cut the corner from the sun and passed on. And there was no shadow fell upon us. And the judge took up his ledger and went on with his entries as before. I watched him. Then I clambered down and tested a patch that stuck with my hand. There was heat coming off of it. I walked along the rim, and the savages was ascended by every quarter, for there was no route to favor on that bald and gravel slope. I looked for rocks of any size to send down, but there was none there larger than your fist, just fine gravel and plates of scrag. I looked at Glanton, and he was watching the judge, and he seemed to have had his wit stole. Well, the judge closed up his little book and took his leather shirt and spread it out in the little cupped place and called for us to bring the stuff to him. Every knife was out, and we went to scraping it up, and him cautioning us not to strike fire on them flints. And we heaped it up in the shit, and he commenced to chop and grind it with his knife. And Captain Glanton, he calls out. Captain Glanton, would you believe it? Captain Glanton, he says. Come charge that swivel bore of yours, and let's see what manner of thing we have here. Glanton come up with his rifle, and he scooped his charger full, and he charged both barrels, and patched 2 balls, and drove them home, and capped the piece, and made to step to the rim. But that was never the judge's way. Down the maw of that thing, he says. And Glanton never questioned it. He went down the pitch of the inner rim to where lay the terminus of that terrible flue, and he held his piece out over it and pointed it straight down and cocked the hammer and fired. You wouldn't hear a sound like it in a long day's ride. It gave me the fidgets. He fired both barrels, and he looked at us, and he looked at the judge. The judge just waved and went on with his grinding. And then he called us all about to fill our horns and flasks. And we did, one by one, circling past him like communicants. And when all had shared, he filled his own flask, and he got out his pistols and saw to the priming. The foremost of the savages was not more than a furlong on the slope. We were ready to lay into them, but again the judge wouldn't have it. He fired off his pistols down into the cauldron, spacing out the shots. And he fired all 10 chambers and cautioned us back from sight while he reloaded the pieces. All this gunfire had given the savages some pause, no doubt, for they very likely reckoned us to be without powder altogether. And then the judge, he steps up to the rim, and he had with him a good white linen shirt from out of his bag, and he waved it to the Redskins, and he called down to them in Spanish. Well, it would have brought tears to your eyes. All dead save me, he called. Have mercy on me. Todos muertos, todos. Waving the shirt. God had set them yapping on the slope like dogs. And he turns to us, the judge, with that smile of his, and he says, "Gentlemen," that was all he said. He had the pistols stuck in his belt at the back, and he drew them one in each hand. And he is as either-handed as a spider. He can write with both hands at a time, and I've seen him to do it. And he commenced to kill Indians. We needed no second invitation. God, it was a butchery. At the first fire, we killed a round dozen, and we did not let up. Before the last poor nigger reached the bottom of the slope, there was 58 of them lay slaughtered among the gravels. They just slid down the slope like chaff down a hopper. Some turned this way, some that, and they made a chain about the base of the mountain. We rested our rifle barrels on the brimstone, and we shot 9 more on the lava where they ran. It was a stand, what it was. Wages was there. The last of them shot was a reckonable part of a mile from the muzzles of the guns, and that on a dead run. It was sharp shooting all around, and not a misfire in the batch with that clear powder. The experts turned to the kid. And that was the judge. First I ever saw him.
Oh, we killed him.
He's a thing to study. The kid looked at Toby. "What's he a judge of?" he said. "What's he a judge of?"
This game.
"What's he a judge of?" Toby glanced off across the fire. "Ah, lad," he said. "Hush now. The man will hear you. His ears like a fox." Chapter 11.
Shit.
Into the mountains.
I don't think I got it.
Old Ephraim. A Delaware.
Time for a killing spree.
The search. Another probate. In the gorge. The ruins. Keat seal. The Solaret. Representations
hell
of
no.
things. The judge tells a story. A mule lost. A scout. Night scene with moon, blossoms, judge. The village. Glad
How the hell did I know?
animals. The trail out. They rode on into the mountains.
Alright.
And their way took them through high pine forests, wind in the trees.
Echo, shut up.
Bird calls. The shoeless mules
Echo.
slow.
Shut up.
Fuck it. Good night.